Okay, today we're going to talk about 29.3, the civil rights in the 1960s. Let's see. So, first of all, we're still mainly focusing on the discrimination and trying to get rights for African Americans. A lot of it was focused on the South, of course, and then also later in the North, trying to get more equality. One of the main forms of protest during this time was a nonviolent form of protest called a sit-in. I'm sure you might have heard of them. This picture and what you might have heard of a lot is the ones at the counters where the lunch counters were segregated and they wouldn't serve, African Americans. And so in this picture, you can see they're trying to do a sit-in, taking up the seats so other people can't come in and be served. And so the point of the sit-in is to hurt the business of the store by, making it difficult for the other people to come in and purchase things. And you can see how they're being treated, like they're pouring things on them and stuff. Really nice. So protesting, you are taking chances of getting a lot of hate and stuff too. This, you can see they're young. There was a big student movement. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a big group that was started, and Ella Baker was one of the big leaders of this, trying to convince college students to join and rather than just being part of the NAACP or some other organizations, have one of their own of the young people and see if they could coordinate and, do things. And it became very popular. Another group was the Freedom Riders. That was a group it was organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. They went down on two buses from Washington, D.C., and they had several stops. Their plan was to go all the way to New Orleans. And remember, we talked about how in 1960, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that bus stations can't be segregated anymore. But they knew that that wasn't really being enforced, so they were trying to, prove it. And so these volunteers went down and they would take these bus rides and stop at all these places to kind of test it and to show what was happening. And of course, they did experience quite a bit of violence, especially as they moved more south. So in Alabama is really where the trouble started, in several stops in Alabama. And you can see here's one picture of one of the buses was put on fire. And, they got harassed and things. When they got to Jackson, Mississippi, they had heard the police that the Freedom Riders were doing this. And so they were ready, waiting for them with the National Guard. And when they tried to enter the whites only section of the waiting room in the bus depot, they were arrested and jailed. So the Freedom Riders kept doing this and trying to push it and show what's happening all summer. And then finally the federal government did move and banned segregation on interstate bus lines and bus stations. So they're trying to get the federal government to get more involved. And it does bring attention to their cause. And so obviously there's, some conflict between the states and the federal government. All right. Also, more examples of conflict in the states, and the civil rights are also being tested in the colleges, higher education. So in 1962, a federal court ruled that the University of Mississippi had to let an African American, James Meredith, in. And he wanted to enroll. And they tried to prevent him. The governor even supported it and sent the state police to keep him from registering. And then Kennedy heard about it, and he, said, no, the federal court said you can't do that, right? So he sent the marshals there to protect Meredith. You can see this picture here. It got violent. Some mobs stormed one of the university buildings and had guns and rocks. And, the marshals ended up using tear gas and nightsticks on the white crowd. And in the end, Marshall did get to register, but 2 ended up dying in the violence. and they ended up having to keep him protected for the whole year for him to graduate. And also another example in Alabama, the governor there, George Wallace, said he wasn't going to let the University of Alabama get desegregated. And Kennedy said, "Oh yeah," and he sent the Alabama National Guard out, and Wallace had to back down because he can't really, do anything. So those are some examples. Other places that there's a lot of protesting going on. Birmingham, Alabama was one of the big places. Again, a very organized effort by the SCLC, and Dr. King was there, and hundreds of people are there and getting arrested, trying to protest segregation laws in the South. He had a very famous letter called the Letter from a Birmingham Jail. When he was arrested, he was criticized by some white church leaders for, civil disobedience, for doing this. And he wrote a very eloquent letter about explaining that, when you've seen your relatives being beaten by the whites, or like all these, disservice they've been getting, it's hard to stand by, and you end up having to finally stand up. And even though he's doing it non-violently, right, he does think that's the right thing to do. So anyway, it was a very eloquent letter. And unfortunately, these, protests, got a lot of media attention. Now we have television, so people at home are watching the coverage, and they're seeing the police dogs, attacking the African Americans, and the white firefighters using fire hoses on the protesters who are, sitting and trying to do, peaceful protest, and then they've turned the fire hoses, which it's not just that you're getting wet, right? They're very harsh. How it would hurt, and it's it's more than just getting wet. So anyway, so they were treated pretty badly by the authorities, and so that got public, right? So President Kennedy ended up sending 3,000 troops there to restore the peace because it was so bad in Birmingham, and then he addressed the issue on television. And then finally, Congress does send some new legislation to try to make segregation stop in all public places, and to stop discrimination for employment. And there's a huge march, and you can see the pictures here. More than 200,000 people show up for this march on Washington. And even though there was so many people, right, Dr. King is telling everyone and the other leaders, we're not going to have violence. This is a peaceful walking protest. And they didn't have any trouble, even though there were quite a few police officers there, just like directing the traffic and everything. They sang "We Shall Overcome." I don't know if you know that song. While they walked, and of course, Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I'm not sure if you've heard that speech. I know in 8th grade you do a version of your own "I Have a Dream," so you guys aren't there yet, but you've probably at least heard of it. Okay, and then, of course, as you know, we already foreshadowed that Kennedy was going to get assassinated in November of 1963, so he does not end up seeing his civil rights dream, happen. But Lyndon Johnson took it and went ahead and pushed Congress to pass it, so it finally does pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Which outlaws discrimination in hiring practices, and it's going to end segregation in all stores and restaurants and theaters and hotels, all the public places. Even though that is now the law, the southern, counties and everything found ways around it and did things like a poll tax. I don't know if you've heard about a poll tax. We've had them in previous history, right, that if you charge money to vote, then a lot of people are African American or poor and they can't afford it and things like that, some other rules. trying to get around, keeping them down and not letting them vote. So there was a big movement called the Freedom Summer Campaign, where thousands, and the reason it's in the summer is a lot of them are college kids, and they all volunteered to go down to the South and help African Americans register to vote. So you can see in the picture there, right? That's what they're doing, trying to explain and help them with paperwork and things. And of course, there's a mixture of African American and white, students doing this. And of course, they experienced a lot of hate from the white Southerners and some violence. And even eventually 3 civil rights workers. There's a few different stories, right, of violence. There's one story I remember that wasn't in your book about some civil rights activists who were put in jail without getting their call to anyone, and then they got released, and the police called the Ku Klux Klan out, and they came and shot them and beat one of them and beat up the other and killed the other 2. And those were some activists. Your book here mentions that these other 3 went missing, and then they eventually, found them dead. Much later, they find out that it was the Ku Klux Klan that had, kidnapped them. Anyway, so this is setting off, right, more and more examples of people, a lot of, people trying to fight back for their rights. They mention here in the book that Selma, Alabama was another big protest where African Americans are being denied their rights, and the police would beat and attack the demonstrators. So even the police were, against the rights. And the president at the time, right, Johnson, tries to address this. And again, they pass another Voting Rights Act. And this one is saying, like, the federal government can make the local officials let them register to vote. So it's trying to, establish, who has the power. Okay, and then let's go on to, so we talked a lot about Dr. King, but there are some people who had a kind of a different view of how to deal with things. So there's a few different ones. So the first picture there on the top left is Malcolm X. His real name was Malcolm Little. And he was the leader of the Nation of Islam, or more commonly called Black Muslims. And he basically stopped, I wrote interrogation. I meant, that's not what I meant. African Americans, he thought, should not integrate, and they should just live apart. Like, it's not going to work. He actually softened his language in later years, but then he got killed by a rival Black Muslim person. So he was killed. And then the next picture is Stokely Carmichael, who's started something called the Black Power movement. It's all about racial pride and having pride in the African American way and kind of creating their own culture. And it became very popular. And then the Black Panther Party is the next one there, with the guys holding the weapons. This started in Oakland, California. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale started it. And they were all about, like, kind of harnessing everyone's anger about their situation and their poverty and having no jobs. And they were more confrontational, demanded the reforms they wanted, and like you see in the picture, were armed, and therefore they got in quite a few clashes with the police. And so, things are in the 60s are getting, there's a lot of clashes going on. There's a week-long riot, basically, in the Watts area of Los Angeles in 1965, and it was terrible, and so many people, 34 people ended up dying in those riots, and they ended up having to call the National Guard out to stop it. And this is not the only one. So just in general, over the next few years, there's quite a few different riots in protests going on in different cities, and a lot of looting. And so they say about 26 different deaths and $10 million in property damage in that one next example in New Jersey. And there's other ones too. They mentioned there, like Detroit. They had to shut down the city for about like a week because of all the protests. So a lot of violence and protests going on. And then it's right around that time in April of 1968 that Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated. James Earl Ray was the person who they caught. He shot him. You can see the picture where they're saying where the shot came from. He was shot, and they went and found the weapon and with his fingerprints, and then they took him a while, but they finally tracked him down. And then he was a known racist and kind of loser, right? He was arrested many times and things. So anyway, obviously that was a huge loss because Dr. King was trying to get everyone to do everything like calmly, and he had thousands of people attend his funeral, and since not everyone could attend, they televised it actually, and millions of people watched on television. So we will talk next time about other groups that are also fighting for their rights, not just African Americans.